In the quiet suburbs of America, children ride their bikes through tree-lined streets, their laughter echoing in the twilight. Parents tuck their little ones into bed, whispering goodnight stories about brave knights and distant kingdoms. But what if I told you that behind the closed doors of government facilities, a different kind of story was being written? A story so dark, so twisted, that when Hollywood finally decided to tell it, they had to wrap it in the safe disguise of science fiction. This is not a tale of monsters from another dimension. This is not a story about telekinetic girls or shadowy government conspiracies dreamed up in a writer's room. This is the true story behind Stranger Things, and it is far more terrifying than anything the Upside Down could ever offer. Because the real monsters were not creatures of fiction. They were men in lab coats, carrying clipboards and government clearances, who believed that the mind of a child was just another puzzle to be solved, another weapon to be forged in the fires of the Cold War. You think you know the story of Hawkins National Laboratory. You think you understand the experiments that created Eleven and her fellow test subjects. But the reality is that the Duffer Brothers did not invent these horrors. They simply gave them a new name, a new face, and a television-friendly coating of supernatural dread. The truth is that for decades, in facilities across America, children were subjected to experiments that would make Dr. Brenner look like a saint. What you are about to discover will change the way you watch Stranger Things forever, because every injection, every isolation chamber, every moment of psychological torture inflicted upon Eleven was not born from imagination. It was born from the documented, declassified, and utterly real history of programs with names like MK Ultra, operations so classified that even now, 50 years later, most of their records have been destroyed. Programs that turned American citizens into unwitting test subjects in the name of national security. The story begins not in the fictional town of Hawkins, Indiana, but in the very real corridors of power in Washington, D.C. in the early 1950s. The Cold War was not just a battle of ideologies or nuclear arsenals. It was a war for the human mind itself. American intelligence agencies, terrified that Soviet scientists had discovered ways to control and manipulate human consciousness, launched their own desperate search for the ultimate weapon. Not a bomb that could level a city, but a technique that could turn any person into a perfectly obedient agent, a walking weapon programmed to carry out any command. The man who would oversee this search was a brilliant chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. To his colleagues, he appeared to be nothing more than a mild-mannered scientist with a slight stutter and a passion for folk dancing. But to the thousands of unwitting test subjects who would fall under his influence, he would become something far more sinister. He would become the real-life inspiration for every fictional mad scientist who ever claimed to be working for the greater good while committing unspeakable acts in the name of science. In April 1953, Gottlieb was given control of a program that would be known by the code name MK Ultra. The goal was simple in its stated purpose and horrifying in its execution. Find a way to control the human mind. Discover methods to erase memory, implant false beliefs, and turn any individual into a programmable asset. The techniques they would employ read like a catalog of human cruelty. High doses of LSD administered without consent. Electroshock therapy designed not to heal, but to shatter the psyche. Sensory deprivation that could drive a person to madness. And at the center of it all, a philosophy that viewed human beings not as individuals with rights and dignity, but as raw material for experimentation. The scope of these experiments was vast and systematic. MKUltra operated through a network of universities, hospitals, and research centers across North America. Prestigious institutions that you would recognize, places where parents sent their children for treatment, unknowingly delivering them into the hands of researchers who saw them as nothing more than test subjects in a grand and terrible experiment. The victims were chosen with calculated cruelty. Mental patients who had no legal advocates, prisoners who had no voice to protest their treatment, drug addicts and prostitutes who, as one CIA officer coldly noted, were people who could not fight back, children with developmental disabilities whose parents had entrusted them to the care of medical professionals. These were the forgotten, the vulnerable, the ones society had already decided did not matter, and that made them perfect subjects for experiments that no ethical review board would ever approve. In one documented case, a mental patient in Kentucky was given LSD for 174 consecutive days. Imagine that horror. Nearly 6 months of being trapped in a chemically induced nightmare with no understanding of why reality had become a waking hallucination. 7 African American participants at a research center were dosed with LSD for 77 straight days, their minds systematically dismantled in the name of scientific progress. But perhaps the most chilling parallel to the world of Stranger Things comes from the experiments conducted on children. Published medical papers from this era describe the administration of massive doses of LSD to mentally disabled children. These were not teenagers who could at least comprehend what was happening to them. These were young children, some barely old enough to speak, who were subjected to mind-altering drugs in quantities that would be dangerous for a full-grown adult. The researchers documented everything with the cold precision of scientists studying lab rats. They measured the children's responses, noted their breakdowns, and recorded their suffering as data points in research papers that would later be quietly filed away and forgotten. When you watch Eleven strapped to a chair in Hawkins' lab, electrodes attached to her skull while Dr. Brenner calmly takes notes, you are not witnessing science fiction. You are witnessing a sanitized recreation of documented historical fact. The true horror of MKUltra was not just in its methods, but in its complete disregard for informed consent. Subjects were rarely told what was being done to them. Patients who entered hospitals for routine treatment found themselves unwitting participants in experiments that would leave them permanently damaged. College students who volunteered for what they believed were harmless psychological studies discovered they had been dosed with powerful hallucinogens. Even CIA employees were not safe from their own program, with agents secretly dosing their colleagues to study the effects of surprise LSD administration. One of the most famous victims of these experiments was a man who would later become one of Boston's most notorious criminals. Whitey Bulger volunteered for what he was told was research aimed at finding a cure for schizophrenia. Instead, he was given LSD every day for more than a year. Decades later, he would realize that he had been nothing more than a guinea pig in a government experiment designed to see what long-term exposure to psychedelic drugs would do to the human mind. The parallels to Stranger Things become even more disturbing when you consider the ultimate goal of these experiments. The researchers were not content with simply studying the effects of drugs and psychological torture. They wanted to create something far more ambitious and terrifying. They wanted to produce individuals whose minds could be completely controlled, who could be programmed like computers to carry out specific tasks without question or memory of their actions. This was the dream of the perfect assassin, the ideal spy, the ultimate weapon in human form, someone who could be sent on a mission, complete their objective, and return with no memory of what they had done. The researchers believed that by breaking down the human psyche completely, they could rebuild it according to their own specifications. In the sterile laboratories where these experiments took place, children who exhibited any unusual abilities were of particular interest to the researchers. They were searching for individuals who might possess what they termed enhanced psychological capabilities. Children who seemed unusually perceptive, who displayed signs of heightened intuition, or who showed any indication of what might be called extrasensory perception, became prime candidates for the most intensive phases of the program. These young subjects were isolated from their families, often for months at a time. They were told that they were receiving special treatment, that they were part of an important medical study that would help other children. The reality was far different. They were being systematically broken down, their personalities dismantled piece by piece, in the hope that something new and controllable could be built from the wreckage of their former selves. The techniques used were designed to create a state of complete psychological dependency. Children were kept in sensory deprivation chambers for days, their minds left to fracture in the absence of any external stimulation. They were subjected to prolonged interrogation sessions where the line between reality and hallucination was deliberately blurred. Some were given drugs that induced terrifying visions, then told that these nightmares were real memories that needed to be explored and understood. The goal was to create what the researchers called a blank slate, a mind so thoroughly shattered that it could be reprogrammed with new memories, new loyalties, new purposes. The children who survived these procedures often emerged as hollow shells of their former selves, their original personalities buried beneath layers of induced trauma and artificial conditioning. But the true story behind Stranger Things extends beyond the laboratories of MKUltra. The conspiracy theories that inspired the Duffer Brothers reach back to a small town on the eastern tip of Long Island, where local legends speak of experiments that make the official CIA programs look tame by comparison. This is the story of Camp Hero and the infamous Montauk Project, a tale so bizarre and disturbing that it served as the original inspiration for what would eventually become the world of Hawkins National Laboratory. According to the testimonies of men who claim to have been involved, Camp Hero was the site of experiments that pushed the boundaries of known science into realms that most would consider pure fantasy. Time travel research that allegedly opened doorways to other dimensions. Psychic enhancement programs that created children with abilities far beyond anything documented in official government records. And most disturbing of all, systematic abductions of local children who were used as test subjects in experiments that their own government would never officially acknowledge. The stories that emerged from Montauk in the 1980s told of underground facilities that stretched for miles beneath the abandoned military base. Laboratories where children were subjected to procedures that made MK Ultra look like a humanitarian effort. According to these accounts, researchers had discovered ways to amplify psychic abilities through a combination of psychological conditioning, electromagnetic manipulation, and pharmaceutical enhancement that created individuals with genuine supernatural powers. Preston Nichols, a man who claimed to have recovered repressed memories of his involvement in the Montauk Project, described experiments where children were trained to project their consciousness across vast distances, to manipulate electronic equipment with their thoughts, and even to open rifts in the fabric of space and time itself. These children, according to his testimony, were known as the Montauk Boys, and they were considered the most valuable and dangerous weapons in America's secret arsenal. The selection process for these experiments was said to be particularly cruel. Children were chosen not just for their potential psychic abilities, but for their isolation from society. Runaways, orphans, children from broken homes who would not be missed if they disappeared. They were brought to the facility through a network of social services, juvenile detention centers, and psychiatric hospitals that served as feeding grounds for the project's insatiable need for test subjects. Once at Montauk, these children were subjected to a regimen of conditioning that was designed to strip away their individual identities and replace them with something entirely artificial. They were given numbers instead of names, housed in identical cells, and subjected to daily sessions of psychological manipulation that gradually erased their memories of life before the facility. The electromagnetic equipment allegedly used in these experiments was said to be capable of amplifying and focusing human psychic energy in ways that could affect reality itself. Children who showed the greatest aptitude for these enhanced abilities were subjected to increasingly intense sessions, their minds pushed to the breaking point in the pursuit of ever greater power. According to the testimonies, many of the children did not survive the process. Those who did were forever changed, their personalities fractured and reformed according to the needs of their handlers. They became living weapons, capable of extraordinary feats, but completely dependent on their controllers for direction and purpose. The parallels between these accounts and the story of 11 are impossible to ignore. A girl with a number instead of a name, isolated from the world, subjected to painful experiments that enhanced her psychic abilities while destroying her connection to her own humanity. The sensory deprivation tank that serves as her gateway to the psychic realm. The cold, clinical environment of Hawkins' lab with its endless corridors and numbered doors. But perhaps the most disturbing parallel is the fate of the other children in the program. In Stranger Things, we learn that 11 was not the first, that there were others who came before her, children whose numbers marked their place in a long line of failed experiments. In the testimonies from Montauk, survivors speak of dozens of children who entered the program but never left, whose minds were pushed too far and shattered beyond repair. The official records of the Montauk Project do not exist. Unlike MKUltra, which left behind thousands of documents that were declassified in the 1970s, the alleged experiments at Camp Hero remain in the realm of testimony and recovered memory. But the impact of these stories on popular culture has been profound, creating a mythology of government conspiracy and supernatural experimentation that continues to influence how we think about the relationship between power and the vulnerable. The question that haunts investigators is not whether these experiments happened, but how many children suffered in silence, their stories buried beneath layers of classification and denial. The techniques described in the Montauk testimonies find disturbing echoes in documented cases from across the country where children with unusual abilities were quietly removed from their families and placed in specialized facilities that promised treatment but delivered something far more sinister. One particularly chilling aspect of these programs was the systematic targeting of children who displayed what researchers termed anomalous psychological profiles. These were not necessarily children with obvious mental health issues, but rather those who exhibited heightened sensitivity, unusual perceptual abilities, or what some might call intuitive gifts that defied conventional understanding. Schools, hospitals, and social services became unwitting recruitment centers, identifying children whose unique traits made them valuable to programs that operated in the shadows of legitimate research. The conditioning process, described by survivors, follows a pattern that appears across multiple testimonies. Children were first isolated from any familiar environment, stripped of personal belongings and connections to their previous lives. They were then subjected to a systematic process of psychological deconstruction, where their sense of self was gradually eroded through a combination of sensory manipulation, pharmaceutical intervention, and emotional isolation. The goal was not simply to study these children, but to remake them entirely. Researchers believed that by breaking down the natural barriers of the human psyche, they could create individuals whose consciousness could be shaped and directed according to their specifications. The children who emerged from these programs bore little resemblance to the individuals who had entered them, their original personalities buried beneath layers of artificial conditioning and induced trauma. What makes these accounts particularly disturbing is the clinical precision with which they were conducted. This was not random cruelty or sadistic experimentation, but a systematic program designed to push the boundaries of human consciousness in service of national security objectives. The researchers involved were highly educated professionals, many with advanced degrees from prestigious universities, who approached the destruction of young minds with the same methodical care that others might apply to nuclear physics or rocket science. The facilities where these experiments allegedly took place were described as underground complexes that could have been lifted directly from the pages of a science fiction novel. Miles of corridors lined with identical rooms, each containing a single bed, a chair, and monitoring equipment that tracked every aspect of the subject's physical and psychological state. The children who lived in these spaces knew them only by numbers, their entire world reduced to a grid of coordinates and identification codes. But the most haunting element of these testimonies is not the description of the experiments themselves, but the accounts of what happened to the children who survived them. According to those who claim to have witnessed these programs firsthand, many of the subjects developed abilities that defied scientific explanation. Children who could manipulate electronic equipment with their thoughts, who could project their consciousness across vast distances, who could access information that should have been impossible for them to obtain. These enhanced individuals were not celebrated for their extraordinary gifts, but rather treated as living weapons whose sole purpose was to serve the interests of their creators. They were trained to use their abilities in ways that served intelligence gathering, remote surveillance, and psychological warfare operations that pushed the boundaries of what most people would consider possible or ethical. So the next time you watch Stranger Things, remember that the true horror lies not in the fictional monsters of the Upside Down, but in the documented reality of what was done to real children in the name of progress. The Duffer Brothers didn't create these nightmares from imagination. They simply held up a mirror to our own dark history.